Hello and welcome back to English Language Arts class. Today we're looking again at independent and dependent clauses. We're going to go a little bit more in depth today. Hopefully you already watched the clauses and introduction video. If not, I would say stop this one, go back and watch that first, and then come back because it will help you to know the definition of what a clause is. We will review it though really quickly. A clause, and no, we're not talking about Santa Claus here. A clause in a sentence is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, or a verb phrase, which is also called a predicate. And then again, the subject is a noun, and it's specifically the noun that is the main topic of the sentence or the clause. Also, remember that there are two kinds of clauses. There are independent clauses and dependent clauses. You may remember that an independent clause is a clause that expresses a complete thought and can stand alone. We also call this a sentence. So clauses, an independent clause can serve as a sentence all by itself. It can stand alone. So some examples of independent clauses are he memorized a poem last night. Notice he and memorized are underlined because that is the subject and the predicate in the sentence, or the subject and the verb are underlined in these examples. Also notice there are no periods and he is not capitalized because again, these clauses are part of a larger sentence and not sentences on their own, though you could see they could be sentences all by themselves if they were not. Another example would be Mary will read her poem. Mary is the subject, will read is the predicate or the verb in this case, or the verb phrase in this. And again, that's a complete thought on its own. Mary will read her poem. That could be its own sentence. Another example would be many people enjoy poetry. People is the subject, enjoy is the verb, and the whole independent clause is many people enjoy poetry. Now what you may notice about independent clauses is they, as we said, they could be sentences on their own, but another way to sort of expand your writing is to not just write these short sentences, but to actually expand them and add a dependent clause to them to add a little bit more details and meaning to your sentences. So we could add, for instance, Mary will read her poem. Could be a sentence on its own, but instead I could also add more details or more meaning to that by adding a dependent clause like Mary will read her poem tonight at the open house. So tonight at the open house would be a dependent clause. It wouldn't make sense on its own, but when I combine it, I make a more detailed sentence that is a lot more interesting than just Mary read her poem. But that's just an example. When an independent clause starts with a capital letter and ends with a period or a question mark, it makes its own sentence. So just like we said, we could change an independent clause into a sentence on its own. But usually this involves breaking up a more detailed sentence into a simpler one. So we usually don't do that when we have independent clauses linked with dependent clauses, but you can do that. So in our three cases above, he memorized a poem. Mary will read her poem at school. Many people enjoy poetry. So we've created sentences out of our independent clauses, and they make sense and they work. And that is something you cannot do with a dependent clause. Because a dependent clause is a clause that does not express a complete thought, and it cannot stand by itself as a sentence. So I can't just capitalize the first letter and put a period at the end and have a complete sentence. Here I've taken my three examples from above, but I've made them into dependent clauses because he memorized a poem. So now that would not make sense on its own because he memorized a poem is not a complete thought. When Mary reads her poem at school. Since many people enjoy poetry. Now these are all examples of dependent clauses that would not make sense on their own without adding an independent clause to them. If I try to make a dependent clause into a sentence, what I get is called a sentence fragment. So a dependent clause will become a sentence fragment when the clause begins with a capital letter and ends in punctuation, basically, in a period or a question mark or even a exclamation point. And this is a grammatical error. So, for instance, if I tried to take because he memorized a poem and make it its own sentence, hopefully you can see that that doesn't make sense on its own, and it's an example of a sentence fragment. And anytime I have a sentence fragment, it tells me that I need to add more information to that sentence in order for it to be grammatically correct and for it to make sense. So what makes a clause dependent? A clause is dependent when it begins with a subordinate word. So this is one example of when we see dependent clauses. A subordinate word would be examples like when, while, which, because, since, unless. So anytime I have a word like that beginning a clause, those are words that tell me that I need an independent clause, or I need more details for my my thought to make sense. So let's take a look at that. Dependent clause needs an independent clause to create a true sentence. So again, if I take that example, because he memorized a poem, I have the subordinate word because in front of my thought of he memorized a poem. So it can't be a sentence on its own unless I add more detail. So I add an independent clause. In this case, Cooper will receive extra credit. Cooper will receive extra credit would make sense all by itself. But when I add the dependent clause because he memorized a poem, I get a more meaningful, more detailed sentence that has more information for my reader. So the full sentence would be because he memorized a poem, comma, Cooper will receive extra credit. Now I could also switch around the two clauses. I can move the independent and the dependent around so that the independent clause comes first and the dependent comes second. And that would look like Cooper will receive extra credit because he memorized a poem. So I like to think of this in terms of math, of the commutative property. If you may remember, we studied that a lot in math, where in addition or multiplication sentences, I can move around the digits and it still makes sense. Well, that's the same thing with independent and independent clauses, is I can move them around in the sentence, but as long as I keep the clauses intact when I move them, it'll still make sense. As you can see with this example. Now when I do that though, if the dependent clause comes first, it's usually followed by a comma. So in the case of when the rain stops, the game will begin. The independent clause is the game will begin, it comes second, but the dependent clause, when the rain stops, comes first, so I have to put a comma there in order for my sentence to be grammatically correct. So when the rain stops, comma, the game will begin. But if I move it around, if I commute it, and the dependent clause comes last, I have the same clauses there. I've just switched them around. And the meaning of the sentence is the exact same, but you'll notice there is no comma here. The game will begin when the rain stops. So that is the presentation. I know Dependent and independent clauses can be a little tricky. Just remember, independent means it could be all by itself. When you think of independent, you think of all alone or all by themselves. And dependent means you rely on something else. So dependent clauses need those independent clauses to be full sentences. If you can remember that, it should make a lot more sense for you going on. So please take time to go down and answer the questions below. If you have any questions or comments about this video, please message me. And other than that, see you next time and take care. Bye.